That was fun. Okay, cool. Um, Here we go. All right. Well, thank you again for just kind of helping us through a lot of this project and presentation, giving us guiding questions and everything. We are so excited to share this information with you. There is a lot that we were able to kind of talk through and research about and just kind of love the Farmling project a little bit more because of how awesome you guys are and the mission that you have. And I hope that a lot of the information and the things that we present to you helps you in some kind of way. We used a lot of our background, our different passions and knowledge and everything like that to present to you the best possible information. And I hope you enjoy it. So what we're going to talk about first is kind of just the objectives of what we saw for each different facets of the project. And a lot of it kind of includes overarching themes. So international policies, using the drawdown data that you kind of said, like, hey, we use this a lot. We use this as a benchmark. So we delved into that a lot and then also narrowed it down to domestic. So we're like, hey, big international policies, these are what other countries are doing. They're doing really great at narrowing it down a little bit. Okay, domestically, what does that look like for us? What does that look like for Farmlink? And then also looking towards couple of opportunities that we found that were really interesting, and I think kind of goes into some of the things that we talked about in our first meeting, like those emissions and transportation, logistics, all that kind of stuff. And then also just kind of building upon this really cool like kind of business model that you guys have with enabling student power and going into more of the indigenous population side of that within the United States, I think is really awesome too. And so we're just looking forward to kind of presenting that your way. So like I said, these are kind of the objectives that we saw for the different facets of the presentation. I'm not going to kind of go through it, but these are the different sources that we did pull from. So at least you have an idea of where we're going with this. And of course, I would love to share this presentation with you after, like email it if you're like, wow, it's a lot of information. And I don't really know what to do with it. I'm like writing it down, but I'll share it with you so it's not overwhelming at all too. And then also the recording, of course. Do you have any questions at all to begin?
No, this is great. This is off to a great start. I'm really excited.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is going to be like the international. So we're going to go really high level, overarching, delve into the policies, the objectives, the different countries that we saw were doing a good job. Jordan's going to talk about a bunch of different countries, like, hey, they're doing really great at this and this. So it has this benchmark for Farmlink to be like, oh, maybe we partner in this way or expand in this way. So I'm going to kick it off to, well, I guess I'm going to kick it off to Autumn first, and she's going to talk a little bit about the drawdown.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. And hello, Sophia. Before Jordan dives into country-specific information, I'm just going to briefly talk about the drawdown report, which I know FarmLink is already aware of. So Project Drawdown found that 1/3 of the food in the world is never eaten. And according to research, waste is higher in low-income areas. This is often unintentional, meaning that this is occurring on farms and through the storage and distribution process. On the opposite side, in high income areas, food waste can be seen further down in the supply chain. This is essentially when retailers or consumers neglect or reject non-perfect fruits and vegetables, or when consumers buy or retailers order too many for restaurants and serve too much food. During the food cycle, numerous resources go into producing, packaging, and transporting food. And when the food is wasted, so are the resources. So that includes seeds, water, fertilizer, financial capital. And then according to Project Drawdown, 8% of global emissions are caused from this food waste. So to combat this, researchers at Project Drawdown came up with the reduced food waste solution to minimize food loss and waste at all stages. Christina, next slide, please. So seeking to evaluate the effects of food waste, Project Drawdown created a model to show the project consumption and waste, and this is from 2020 to 2050. So to conduct this research, they based the total estimate or total demand for food on estimated kilocalories per year for consumption by all people in the world. Baseline food consumption was at 2,060 kilocalories per capita per year. And then the research group also forecasted future consumption, reflecting potential dietary changes for all people and the impacts of countries where the population is expected to soar significantly in the next 30 years, like India and China. So total food loss was calculated based on the regional estimate of waste at each stage within the supply chain. And then 2 adoption scenarios were calculated to show the impacts of reduced food waste. The first scenario, total global food loss and wastage is reduced by 50% by 2050. And then scenario 2, total global food loss and waste is reduced by 75% by 2050. Emissions also had to be estimated in this. So to estimate emissions, commodity-specific carbon dioxide equivalent per capita values were used to estimate emission factors, meaning emissions were then multiplied by annual food demand for the country and commodity to research the carbon dioxide equivalent values for the food. Total reduction in food loss was then calculated by weight and commodity, and researchers guessed that the reduced food loss can be converted to feed unnourished populations in countries like China and India. Research found that plant-rich diets that divert food to undernourished populations can avoid between 88.5 to 102.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by 2050. And Project Drawdown concluded that by reducing food loss, the approximately a 60% gap between the availability of food and food needed by 2050 can be decreased. So in essence, the research hints that these findings can help reduce hunger around the globe. Next slide.
All right. Hello. Thank you, Autumn. Excuse me. My name is Jordan. I'm going to be looking at the summaries of international food waste policies based on some of the top performers against specifically SDG 12 about responsible consumption and production, which has the sub-target of 12.3 on food loss and waste. Of course, it's all connected. And so what I did was go through a massive literature policy online review, found great resources, global statistics, a lot of international publications and scholarly articles. And this is what we came up with. Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, we'll start with the Nordic countries. They are performing relatively well. Much lower than the US. The US wastes 135 kilograms per capita per year per person. As frame of reference, Sweden is looking at 71.5, Denmark at 82.6, and Finland at 63.6, which still seems like a lot, but comparatively, they're doing quite well compared to the US. So what they're doing is we'll look at Sweden, which is #1 in the Food Sustainability Index for managing food waste. And that's on the whole. It doesn't mean they have the least food waste. It just means they're performing #1 in a holistic approach. So they created their food waste goals going back to 2010. So before the UN even adopted the 17 SDGs and these directives as a whole. And they started tracking a long time ago as well. They're still aiming for another 20% reduction by 2025. And what they measured, what they targeted was the highest amount of wasted food in the country. They determined that was coming from cafeterias, catering, school lunches, places that feed lots of people on a regular basis. And they measured that waste and then they acted upon it. So this Target Measure Act approach is recommended by the UN. And it is a common theme that we're going to see through these successful countries. Sweden, 75% of their food waste must be treated biologically, meaning like compost, anaerobic digestion, other matter decomposing it. And so this considers sustainable agriculture, water management, conservation holistically as part of this issue and as part of the solution. And so they are targeting their biggest wasters in cafeterias and schools. Denmark has more food waste initiatives in place than any other country. I couldn't fit them all here, so I just threw in a few to make the point that they're really innovative. It's a widespread effort, and it was generally started by her name is Selena, you'll see in there, and she was a Ukrainian immigrant to Denmark. And she said the worst culture shock that she had didn't have to do with cities or language or people or education, anything like that. It was the fact that people would waste food at every meal. And she could not believe it. And at her home in Ukraine, it just was not done. And she started this entire national in Denmark campaign, and then it went international. So she is almost single-handedly to credit for this start. Yeah, so now it's in partnership with the Dutch government, the EU, and the UN. There's Too Good to Go, which I use here in my hometown of Brunswick and in Portland. Restaurants are able to, and bakeries, other food suppliers, they're able to log on to this app at the end of the day and say, hey, we'll have 5 surprise bags for someone to pick up for $5 tomorrow morning at 9. And you buy these, goodie bags from a local bakery or a great coffee shop that you love or a lunch spot. You don't know what you're going to get in there necessarily, but for $5, you're going to get a whole bag of surplus food that they would have been wasted otherwise. And that started in Denmark, and that is actually international now. It's a great app to model after that I just wanted to bring some attention to. And then they had WeFood. It was Copenhagen's first food waste supermarket. So they took surplus foods that would have been wasted otherwise, diverted it to a supermarket. People come in and fill up a bag for €2 or £2, and that's that. They opened a second one within a year because it was so successful. And so that helps in all of those same areas that Sweden's looking at as far as conservation and agriculture as well. Likewise, Finland prioritizes those things, and they have created not a supermarket necessarily, but the global food produce trade portal. Kind of the same idea as Farmlink or Too Good to Go. Like, hey, we've got this massive amount of carrots. Who wants it? The supply chain got stopped at a certain point, and now, we're stuck with it and they're going to go to waste. Who wants to order it? So they're connecting suppliers and buyers at reduced cost to buyers and reduced waste to suppliers. Next slide, please. In the UK, their reported food waste is 73.1 kilograms per person annually, and in Ireland, 54.7. The UK was the first country to achieve the halfway point to 2030. They hit 27% of food waste reduction, and they have surpassed that mark. And they've done that through public-private partnerships, multi-sector partnerships and collaborations across multiple points in the supply chain. And so they started Love Food, Hate Waste as a consumer behavior change program. Large food corporations achieved waste reductions larger than 25% following the Target Measure Act approach also. And then there's a really cool restaurant opportunity that they started in London, and it's called Food for Soul, and it has since gone international, I believe. And they offer surplus food meals in like a restaurant type setting. You go in and everything you order off a menu or that they're serving is from surplus food. And so it's available to everyone. It actively sources that surplus produce and works toward the sustainable, resilient food culture and economy for everyone. And in Ireland, their 5 largest retailers, such as, I don't know if you've all ever been to Ireland, but Tesco is everywhere. It's where lots of people living in cities just grab their daily meals and food. Lots of things are packaged. But the 5 largest retailers in Ireland have signed on to support the donation of surplus food. And Ireland's new law requires waste service providers to provide food waste bins, and they collect that as well and turn it into biogas for electricity. So Clean Ireland Recycling is the one who offers those compost tutorials, again, public education systems, attitude change, culture shift, issue blindness, all these educational campaigns across mainly the European Union is what we're looking at, have been very successful. And then there's foodcloud.com, similar concept to Farmlink. Next slide, please. Any questions so far?
No, this is fantastic. Keep going. Super
Okay.
interesting.
Just hop in there if something strikes you. And we'll almost be done with these. So France, food waste reported 67.2 and Italy 78.6. So again, well under the US. France and Italy both passed their own versions of an anti-food waste act in 2016. So it was, proposed and recommended. France adopted it, and part of their strategy was shorter sprints to short 5-year plans to kind of include food distribution, emphasize education, and also facilitate supportive environments to make healthy decisions. So if, kids are in a school with vending machines and sodas and all sorts of stuff like that, they're going to buy it. It's going to create more waste. It's not nutritionally sound. So that is part of their program. Dogs, sorry. What they did with the anti-food waste project is they actually are working on a fining system for non-compliance if food suppliers do not donate surplus foods to partnering charities. Italy said, no, we're not going to do that, but we will put some tax money on the table. So if you don't donate, you are leaving a whole bunch of tax return money untapped. And, suppliers generally don't like to do that. I apologize. No one else is home to quiet my dog right now. Okay. And so rather than implement the mandates and fines, Italy is doing something more like lifting the barriers to traditional food banking and food surplus donation. I know we've seen that sometimes at food banks. Companies like Nestle say that you absolutely cannot donate their food if it's on or after the expiry date, and you watch this stuff get dumped. Italy is saying, we're lifting that crap. Like, people need these things, and it's perfectly fine for them to make their choices on those products. And also here are the perishable things that can get donated as well in a shorter amount of time by lifting those restrictions. Because of that, it has a 10 priority plan for food waste and distribution. I didn't list it there, but again, it emphasizes the fact that they're getting the government involved. It's multi-sector, involves education, it's holistic, target measure act. And they also established the PINPAS, which is the National Food Waste Prevention Program. And in collaboration with Fusions, I forget the acronym, they are really working toward reducing food waste. And those activities were really the foundation for law change and policy change in Italy on the issue of food loss. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I want to go back to France. Sorry for jumping around a little. The agroecology project of France is a big one also. So this is something that was proposed in 2016. And the agroecology program in France looks at food producers, their use of pesticides, water, irrigation, distribution, food loss, all of it, again, holistically. They've proven and shown, even in the historic French wine industry, where they generally use glyphosate and pesticides on a regular basis, but they have shown that regenerative, responsible agriculture can increase yield while having the amount of pesticides used minimum. And they expect half of French farmers still to sign on to that by 2025, because it's gained so much traction and there's so much evidence for increased yield to feed a growing population and reduced environmental impact. Now, next slide. And so this just is a description. This is mostly a visual for you all if it's something that you'd like to adopt. It is a very large overarching success story throughout the rest of the world that is progressing well toward SDG 12 and 12.3. Target Measure Act. It's pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes you might need to measure first, but you have your targets as far as your goals. You need to measure where it's going to be most effective and implement plans. And just a handful of other efforts globally that you might want to look at. And this was more intended for you and the Farmlink team after looking at the presentation, if you want to go back and refer to it. So PACE is a program for accelerating the circular economy that was started in the Netherlands. And several of these countries and programs all construct roadmaps for countries. There are programs that will help you construct a roadmap for your country in reducing food waste. And so that started in the Netherlands. NoFoodWaste.org is in India, similar to Farmlink. I thought that was really interesting considering the massive population there, how they're having success. The food bank in Singapore is neat because they have like these consistent cold storage vending machines where they can unload this produce in a predictable area. And then people have these kind of access cards that they can swipe and take the food for free at will. Guatemala and Canada both are really performing well against food waste, but lacking in some other areas, which is why I didn't highlight them in the other countries. But something they do have in common is, like we have in the White House strategy, increasing tribal indigenous access because they are some of the most marginalized and, food insecure as the result of colonization people in these countries. Next.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, now we're gonna start narrowing it down. I think Jordan just kind of provided such an awesome overview of like countries that are really doing really well. And now we're gonna talk about a country that isn't doing as great as these countries, but I think we're on a good start, especially with Farmlink's help. So Autumn, go ahead and go ahead.
All right, thank you. Yeah, great job, Jordan. So now we're going to talk about domestically within the United States, what we're doing here. So the White House strategy on hunger, nutrition, and health was drafted by the Biden and Harris administration in September of 2022. So this strategy serves as a playbook to reach the goal of ending hunger in America while increasing healthy eating and activity by 2030. The goal also supports a decrease in diet-related diseases. So the graphic here just shows how food insecurity and diet-related diseases have individual as well as societal costs, including poor overall health, decreased academic achievements, reduced military readiness, and increased health care costs. Next slide, please. So I heavily focused on Pillar 1, which I thought resonates with Farmlink the most. Pillar 1 strategizes how to eliminate hunger by easing barriers that bar access to affordable food. So tackling this pillar, the administration has taken steps to help Americans become more economically secure. And this is through laws like the American Rescue Plan and the expansion of the child tax credit. In this pillar, the administration also plans to support food sovereignty, including access to traditional foods and supporting tribal communities, as Jordan touched on a little bit in the previous slides. Tribal communities are heavily affected by diet-related diseases, and the government plans to support tribal food sovereignty specifically. Through these efforts, the United States Department of Agriculture plans to continue its efforts in supporting food distribution programs on Indian reservations to expand the availability of indigenous and traditional foods in the food buying guide for child nutrition programs. Additionally, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education will help source these indigenous foods for schools and detention centers. The pillar also aligns with SDGs, namely goals 3 and 10, which the Farmlink project also aligns itself with. Another phase within this pillar seeks to invest in the community and economic development to increase access to food. This aligns with SDG Goal 9, which Farmlink again also aligns itself with. According to the report, there are approximately 40 million Americans that don't live near grocery stores or stores that sell food of any kind. Those with barriers to access food are often low-income people and people of color. Specifically in relation to Farmlink's operational model, the plan seeks to improve transportation options from grocery stores, as well as farmers markets, farms, and commercial areas. To support this initiative, the Department of Transportation, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as various other programs, will work to support transit, bicycle, and other improvements to support food accessibility through transportation. In this section, the strategy also touches on expanding food access to underserved communities, as well as more impoverished communities. Next slide. Again, 1/3 of the food in the United States is wasted or uneaten, according to the report. The administration seeks to prevent food loss and waste across the whole supply chain. And this is a whole government strategy that encompasses the USDA, United States Department of Health and Human Services, the EPA, and the Food and Drug Administration. This is specifically around how to reduce food waste. Additionally, the Department of Health and Human Services, Food and Drug Administration will address food donation and provide recommendations through an update of its food code. And the Department of Treasury will also work to support businesses that donate food, as well as grant opportunities to do so. Next slide. Looking at the EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency's 2030 food loss and waste reduction goal helps supports Farmlink's mission. According to the EPA, approximately 40% of the food in the United States is never eaten, and resources used in order to produce food create environmental impacts, making food loss a timely and pressing issue. Food waste, according to the report, is the most common material in landfills. There are 6 management pathways that food can be sent to. And according to the EPA, this 85% of greenhouse gas emissions result in the production, transportation, processing, and distribution of food. Therefore, preventing food loss is a necessary step to combating climate change. And this is regardless of which of these pathways food is sent to. In 2016, the USDA and EPA announced its joint effort to reduce food loss and waste by 2030. The goal would cut waste in half. This has been the first domestic goal to reduce food loss, and to measure the progress towards the EPA's goal in reaching that goal by 2030. This aligns with SDG target 12.3 to reduce the amount of food from food retail, food service, and households that has been removed from the supply chain, which Farmlink again also aligns with. The EPA and SDGs take into account various avenues to food waste. In 2016, 328 pounds of food waste was wasted per person and was sent through one of these pathways. However, the United States is at an uphill battle in order to meet these targets by 2030, which is quickly approaching. In 2016, from 2016 to 2019, there was a 6% increase in food waste. So we are fighting an uphill battle and going the opposite way. All right, and now I'm going to kick it over to Phil to talk more about emissions.
Yes, my name is Philip, and the thing that was really interesting to me from when we initially met and learning about Farmlink was how much of its work is done in coordinating logistics, travel and freight hauling, you mentioned Uber Freight in one of your videos and stuff like that. So I thought it would be helpful to look not just at the food emissions, but also like the logistical emissions that come with that, since it makes up so much of like the actual operational part of Farmlink. So I'm going to look at the industry as a whole, what's going on, how it's going in the international and domestic logistics freight emission sphere, and how that can be helpful to Farmlink's overall mission. Keeping in mind that for a lot of this, the emissions included are kind of some of which are generated through the food production itself, and a lot of that is through the standard transportation of food, and of course, transiting rescued food, which is what you guys do primarily. You can go next slide, please. So before getting into greater detail, I thought it would be good to look over industrial transport emissions as a whole, some attention to areas within the study of food transit that would be of some use. It's important to keep in mind, first off, the thing that was kind of a shock to me was that road freight is definitely on a very slow track to like complete decarbonization, like people refer to in other industries. And both the EPA and the International Energy Agency and every international like monitor of emissions would agree with this. And that compared to rail, passenger vehicles. Moving into carbon neutrality is not something that it's on an accelerated schedule, and even within the United States too, that's behind that schedule as well. And just again, food freight emissions include both the emissions linked to the transporting of food and also keeping the food temperature controlled, which is another aspect that I didn't really think about before researching this, but it really makes up a large part of emissions. And it's a kind of a marginal thing that can actually be more impacted than other, like just your truck emissions. And while Farmlink specifically operate like within the supply chain itself and not really as like a full-on node like the distribution, since you're taking the food right from the farm or the distribution center to the pantry or food bank, I really wanted to focus on ways that you can't, where you can't alter emissions from that regard, like at the node itself, but from like the transit focus of that. Overall, in terms of road freight, especially food logistical road freight, there's not a lot of like whole industry studies on it. A lot of it is case study basis, and especially with how like where to improve in like the areas that you can cut down on emissions. The more recent studies that revolve around like the temperature controlling have actually found that this is just a few years ago too, before the pandemic, I believe. So this might be even more so now, and that solar powered refrigerant and like solar powered battery usage can actually drastically reduce the refrigerant emissions in moving chilled food, and I believe one of the studies was looking at around 89% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from like diesel powered or some kind of combustion engine fueled refrigeration system for food. And that also included using like a smart integrated system that measured like the temperature of the area around the truck. So then you could better plan out when you were going to need the most cooling. So if your battery, you're going to use your battery when it's already a little colder out, so you use less overall battery. And then if you can only turn on the diesel part when you really need, if it's very hot out or you're in a warmer climate. And then the payback scheme for that is around 5 to 10 years, or at least it was a few years ago. And in the coming decade, as components for solar energy become cheaper, the payback scheme for like the money saved is going to end up being with well under 5 years. So I think that would be in terms of not that Farmlink would, if you're going to operate your own trucks or if you're just going to keep contracting, that there's going to be a reduction in like how much this is going to cost overall. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. So this is just a sample from the International Energy Agency of all the European nations that we mentioned in the previous, when we talked about the food waste, for all their transportation emissions. And as you can see here, I didn't include the United States because of the prevalence of passenger vehicles, which would actually decrease the amount of freight in the percentage here, and also specifics related to United States manufacturing, which would also decrease the road freight share. But I just thought it was important to note that in the United States itself, overall emissions are higher than pretty much all these combined because of the size and intensity of the U.S. population economy. But it's still important to see how much in general road freight makes up in terms of total, this is total emissions, in terms of total emissions. And European emission standards tend to really focus more on pollutants like GHGs and pollutants like non-carbon dioxide or monoxide pollutions. But while American ones are still really focused on fuel efficiency and CO2 as well. The future will definitely see a confluence of standards for road freight, and just cars in general in the next decade. And European standards, it is important to know too that their standards and its economy were the only transportation emissions sector that did see an overall decrease in emissions from 2010 to 2019. Part of that is because of the maturity of the European economic situation, but it also does show that they are at least becoming more sustainable through the specific application of their emission standards for their road freight, passenger vehicles, and everything like that. So they are at least not becoming worse overall and less efficient, which is always a good sign. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is for emissions in the United States. So just the chart here is again from the IEA, which shows United States specific transportation greenhouse gas emissions by source, and you can see that light-duty passenger vehicles are the majority, but medium and heavy-duty freight trucks are a large minority within this sector, and getting that down is actually going to be harder overall, I think, just based on everything I've seen compared to light-duty vehicles because of the lack of penetration of decarbonization and electrification in that area. And in the United States, just as a whole, the average American emits around 14.6 tons of CO2 per person annually, and that part of that is transportation is built into that tonnage, I believe, in most cases, especially for food because of the consumption aspect of that. And road freight in and of itself within the Americas as a whole constitute around 20% of the entire region's greenhouse gas emissions. And the US makes up almost a quarter of world emissions in total and is definitely behind in the transport-related Sustainable Development Goals 12 for like efficient and sustainable production and consumption, and 13, which is the climate change SDG, talking about keeping emissions down. And of course, keeping to those, which would mean, I believe, a 45% reduction in carbon emissions over the next 10 or 20 years. That would keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees, but because the US is behind, it's still leading to above 1.5 degree increase. And it's also important to note that within the next 30 years, the increased demand for transport, as people are predicting, which would be a 2.6-fold increase for freight, does have the potential to offset any emissions or fuel standards that are in place through SDG 12 and 13, because of just the amount of freight that needs to be moved and food. Then you're going to have it might even out or might still increase because of the increased demand. So there has to be more efficiency and more commitment, I think, on that front. And then emissions reporting, this is just something I thought was interesting regarding like gathering information, which is pretty difficult for food logistics specifically because there's less on there online overall about that, which is that emissions reporting and SDG targets are fully present by only 10% of the UN sampled companies. But some sustainability reporting is being done by at least 70% of the United Nations sample. And I thought that this still applies a lot to the United States because the sample is worldwide, but there is a major overrepresentation in the US and Europe in the first place in that sample just because of a variety of institutional factors. And then finally, one thing that's always important to note is why freight it will continue to be the type of polluter that it is and the difficulty that there will be in decarbonization on that front is that heavy duty freight emissions, because of the necessity for moving food, even more so, that like during the pandemic, obviously the freight emissions did not really decrease nearly as much as many other different types of consumption related emitters. We can go to the next slide, please. So here I put a lot of this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I believe you mentioned in one of the meetings, and just me looking at like the problems and successes that you could possibly have when you're looking at freight emissions of food logistics. First of all, that emissions progress on one front can easily be offset by the greenhouse gases produced in higher intensity solutions. And that includes not just in freight, but also in food emissions, like from the actual agricultural process. One example would be urban farming that sometimes because of the need for electricity for light sources ends up consuming more energy than you would have if you had a farm that was 500 miles away from the thing. So it's always important to keep that in mind that the emission, whatever you're doing, is balancing, is not driving up your emissions in another sector you didn't think of in the first place. And then cooling and transportation distances in terms of objects of study are some of the largest variables in food emissions due to the farm specifics, growing efficiency, what kind of truck, what year the truck is made, everything like that. And then more specifically, if you're going to have, I know you guys talked a lot about your average 200-mile trip. So I just wanted to look at how much CO2 that was producing. That's around 600 to 800 pounds of CO2 or 0.3 metric tons. And then that also emits diesel particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, which is ozone depleter, and VOCs, which I will talk about in just a minute, volatile organic compounds, which are unregulated fairly understudied concept. And yeah, Farmlink already has success in limiting distances for food traveled, which I think is very cool, and I really enjoyed that about learning the logistics of that. And that connecting banks and pantries to semi or urban sources that produce at like above efficiency levels will reduce emissions waste, because as long as you are just keeping in mind the amount of distance you have to travel and the emissions from the traveling and stuff, and then the source, you could definitely still make up a lot of emissions. More recently, the 2021 Clean Trucks Initiative from the EPA furthers the 2013 standards that were set up, and then installed new ones for 2027 so they can revise and raise and lower what they think is necessary. And even if these regulations were rolled back, just as a recommendation, I think it would still be important for Farmlink to take a look at what these are and try and adhere to them, because then you would be achieving an above standard emissions plan. And also just in terms of how difficult it is, so to have full electrification and decarbonization of this area, we have 30,000 new electric trucks per year by 2025 and 80,000 per year by 2023. So that could potentially cut into per vehicle emissions for Farmland as Farmland expands. Of course, the pricing on that is going to be very all over the place, but they're still going to be dwarfed by diesel as well. All right, we can go to the next one. So my final notes for emissions is that Farmlink can try and do kind of like a list of food sources that incorporating like constant food sources and more one-off food, like farms that can reduce empty trips or at least minimize the amount of empty trips with a database just that can predict like where you're going to get food and when. And then you can, if you're incorporating the farming techniques to that, you can deliver the most amount of food for the least amount of money and emissions. And following up, if said company is following sustainable practices, and to which standards they're following, updated catalytic converters, exhaust filters, and standards from the EPA, and also something called the Green Freight Handbook, which I don't know if you're aware of, but that is from the Environmental Defense Fund, and it talks just about all kinds of things regarding logistics, per vehicle emissions, how to make your thing more efficient, whether you are the driver itself or the organization or the company that owns a truck. It's a very interesting, have a lot of different things you can look at there. And I know that this is very difficult when you're contracting your trucks versus owning. I think just at least in trying to incorporate it will make a real impact going forward, emissions-wise, because the EPA is recommitting to freight hauling standards since the current standards that we're operating on and not really meeting the Paris Climate Agreement or the COP26 projections for reducing emissions. And the White House's emissions plan, the Clean Trucks Initiative, does hopefully predict that we're going to see nitrous oxide, ozone depleting, reduced by almost half by 2045, diesel particulate matter by 8%, VOCs, which is what essentially creates smog, by 23%, and CO reduction by 18%. And I thought that also this can help. Yes, so let's go to the next slide, please. And so finally, this is our last section where I just thought, keeping all this data in mind, we thought it would be pertinent to synthesize the research in ways that could directly relate to Farmlink's operations and expansion in the future. So my section is first just with logistical networks as opposed to like the per vehicle emissions side. So logistics as an industry lacks many of the targets or regulations as freight vehicles themselves because of the nebulous nature of setting up a logistics network. Farmlink can definitely remain ahead of the curve by incorporating sustainability into a growing logistical network, which means like looking at biofuels, looking at reducing personnel travel emissions, like prioritizing rail or greener energy instead of air travel, especially. Donor and freight tax incentive and awareness as you expand, including both the green aspect of it and the actual tax part as well. More outside partnerships that include international logistical organizations, like SLOCAT, which is the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, and IDDRI, which is the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. If you wanted to go down the international front, of course, there's many other things you can, international regulations that look at that too. There's a lot of domestic partnerships, commerce alliances, Teamsters unions, freight companies, owner operators, people that have their own trucks, that are in the union. And pretty much the Teamsters especially, but all across the board, they've all expressed some need for decarbonization in the future for that. And finally, just regarding what I said earlier about creating like a database of one-off and reliable food sources to deliver to organizations, that a cost-benefit analysis that weighs like the amount of food you're hauling, the environmental impact of the packaging, maybe the distance you're going to travel, most obviously the fuel efficiency, and the state of the truck that you're using, and the cooling needed and temperature. And so then you can minimize your emissions and maximize the amount of food that you're delivering. Thank you.
All right. Everyone's still all right? We're in it for the long haul today. Okay. So moving on to opportunities in the US. In our own nation, 13% of the population lives in food deserts. These are areas where they can't access food of nutritional density that would, sustain them on a regular basis from anywhere from 1 to up to 20 miles. And a lot of these areas, these food deserts, overlap with the federally assigned tribal reserve lands. And in those lands, because of the US's failure to comply, I'm trying to be diplomatic here, with the promises made in the treaties when they forced these Native Americans to these unarable, unfamiliar lands where they couldn't sustain their own foodways, they never gave water. They never provided resources and proper food and food systems. And so 30% still of the Dene, the preferred nomenclature for the Navajo people, households lacked piped water to their home. That means that families, 30% of them in the US, in these areas who don't have access to food anyway, don't even have running water at their home. And that was a huge issue at the pandemic level, because water is necessary for, bodily and environmental and nutritional hygiene. But it really affects it highlights the food insecurity issues too that contribute to ongoing health disparities between white Americans and Native Americans. So not only is this fresh produce hard to come by, due to the distance it travels, regular groceries are priced much higher, an average of 40% more in these low-income, low-access areas than they would be at a regular supermarket or farm stand. And Farmlink prioritizes SDG 10. The White House has clear plans for it in Pillar 1. And this is regarding reducing inequality in food systems for all people and all cultures. They specify that. And this is an actionable target in the US that Farmlink can promote by just improving access to these specific communities, not far from its headquarters. Next slide, please. And so this kind of attaches to Phil's work on the emissions too, as far as reducing empty trips and maximizing fuel efficiency. We could piggyback with the USDA Commodities Distribution Program. And let's see, the USDA Commodities Distribution Program for the tribes started in an effort to kind of quell the noise being made by these starving relocated Native Americans. And they started this as sustenance commodities. And it was originally leftovers from soldiers that could not be eaten, and they were sent as commodity distribution to tribes. And even still, some of these, or a lot of their products, are high in fat, sugars, cholesterol, and contribute to these food insecurity and health issues. And so we're recommending supplementing this USDA commodity box with fresh produce. And again, to Phil's point, is that they have an established distribution system. They work with tribal members at hubs to communicate and accept and deliver these commodity distribution packages. If they had fresh produce from Farmlink in there, Farmlink knows there's going to be a US commodities delivery. Who's got what from farms around that area at that time? Let's get it into there for distribution for this population. Off goes the commodities truck, and Farmlink doesn't have to pay for the distribution, reduces emissions, and actually reduces hunger in a local area Plus a self-governed Farmlink network for the tribes, because the distributions program, once it gets to the tribe, is distributed and managed all by tribal members. It would get surplus foods to those people who need it. Next. And then the other opportunity we recognized that kind of hits at Farmlink's roots, because Farmlink has its roots in student recruitment and mobility and advocacy. And so here we have an opportunity for Indigenous student power through the American Indian College Fund. So they are a nonprofit that support outstanding Indigenous students, many of whom are studying agriculture and working to improve food access for their people as their main goal, because it is such an issue. Two examples are Jacob, who's working on his PhD, working toward creating healthy food sources for his tribal community. Natasha is an undergrad, Danae, also working in agricultural science. It matters a lot to these people. They need these resources. And we have a great opportunity for Farmlink to partner with the American Indian College Fund to recruit and empower these students. And they can do things like expand the technology and refine the Link app that you've already made to be a working model for their own community. And that is very important to the Indigenous community. We have learned it really does need to involve them at all levels. And we want to avoid coming in as, for lack of a better term, white savior to solve all the problems. So we definitely want to, it's critical to make the culturally appropriate relationships and connections first, as Farmlink has already done through the needs survey in partnership with Land O'Lakes and through the Navajo Nation partnership mentioned in the annual report. Next.
Yeah, okay. So that was probably just like a lot of information. And I know we kind of like stopped it at this high point because I know as you guys said through a bunch of your annual reports, like, oh, our average age of fellows is 21. And we saw an opportunity there. We're like, yes, this is awesome for us. So thank you for bearing with us through a lot of this information. And like I said, we're going to send you all of this. Listed are just the resources we've had, just some of many, many that we have come through over the last few weeks and last couple months. But ultimately, I just really appreciate, and we really appreciate your listening, your being curious about what we can do for you, and the fact that we can kind of elevate your really awesome mission and in any way possible. And of course, with Farmlink being a multifaceted company, but also organization, a really game changer within the United States, and knowing that it could go global, it's really comforting to know that we have you guys, and you guys are working so hard. So thank you for letting us be a part of it. And I know we took up a lot of time. I don't want to take up too much of yours, but if you do have any questions right now, or if any that we could talk about in the future, we are more than happy to right now.
Thank you all. This was incredibly impressive. And I know we had a kind of a switch in some ways of the vision of where this was going to go later on. So I appreciate you all adapting with both that and our schedules of getting back to you slowly. Christina's been a sweetheart. But no, I don't have any immediate questions. I'm wildly impressed and am excited to share this with Julia. And I know that some other members of the team will love seeing your slide deck as well, and possibly even the recording. So I'm really excited to pass this along. Just please know this information is going places that will be incredibly helpful. It's not just gonna live in a slide deck. So this is fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah. Does anyone else have any final comments? Obviously, I can't say thank you enough to this entire team for putting their heart and soul into all this information. Obviously a lot of impressive work, a lot of really great knowledge, but also a lot of passion behind it too. So thanks for the entire team for being amazing.
Thank you. It was really awesome to be assigned to something as really great as the Farmlink project that aligns with my own values. And even the pivot toward the end allowed for more research that I found was really fascinating. And I could have written 80 pages on it, but one takeaway I just wanted to mention that I go over in my individual paper, but we didn't really cover here, is the need for advocacy at government and social level. I know you guys are in Washington trying to implement policy, but you are up against a lot. And I say that having just submitted 30 pages of research on who's doing what in there. And lobby spending is 27-1 out favoring environmental efforts right now. Two of those big issues are big ag and big oil. We are not going to ever hit these sustainable development goals unless we get more advocacy out of people who want this and shed light on the fact that other countries can succeed without massive use of agricultural chemicals and petroleum products at all points in the supply chain. They are the biggest lobbyers against environmental action, and they're what's going to keep us back from achieving these SDGs or letting Farmlink progress the way it needs to. That's it.
Yeah, that was also such an impactful point. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, because I saw in the latest annual report just kind of talking a little bit about advocacy, but just knowing where we can go and knowing where the Farmlink project can go it's really awesome. So yeah, if you guys don't have anything else, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but thank you all for being here. And if you need anything, any additional questions, anything from Julia or the rest of the team, we're here to help.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And thank you
Go
for
ahead,
the
Autumn.
opportunity. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. It was really great to work with you all, and this organization is incredible, and I'm just happy to be assigned to this project as well. So this has been really great, informative, a whole a really great experience overall. So thank you.
Great. You are all farm linkers now, you guys. That's a term. You're all farm linkers. And Jordan, thank you for saying that. It is it's an incredible, as Christina said, it's an incredibly important point to drive home, and it's something I'm thinking about every day. Yeah, it's an interesting beast in front of us of how we're gonna figure out how we can get our exciting mission to the right people, but also in the right way and with the right players. So we're working on it. We're working on an event in Congress this summer, so that's exciting. So we'll see what happens there. First step of many that will need to be taken. But thank you all so much once again. It's been and don't be a stranger. Please reach out. Like I said, your farm linkers, please reach out at any point to Julia and I.
Sounds great. Thank you again. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.